Welcome back to the second panel, which is about overlooked NTA arrangements or non-territorial autonomy in combination with other forms of minority protection. Goes a bit into the direction what Jeremy asked before. Does it make a difference? I think it makes a difference, but nevertheless it is very interesting to look also at the arrangements before they became law, or some arrangements never became law. We have three guests on this panel. Our first speaker is Tamara Scheer. She is a historian at the Institute for East European History, so a colleague of mine, but only half a colleague because her second part lives in Rome at the Pontifical Institute Santa Maria dell'Anima, where she also holds a position. And she is a specialist on the Austro-Hungarian army in many different contexts, be it in occupation contexts in First World War Bosnia, be it in pre-First World War Ottoman/Habsburg Sanjak, or her latest, not yet book, but habilitation and hopefully soon book on language and linguistic diversity in the Habsburg army. And today she will talk about a new research endeavor that she is about to start on the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and ethno-linguistic diversity. Tamara, please.
Thank you. So take my phone just to stick to the time frame. It's not F5 any longer, so how can I start my presentation? Seemingly it's not F5. Okay. There is somehow a new version. Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Boris, and all the others from this fascinating project for the invitation to, well, finally, it's the first time I'm presenting a new research project, which hopefully will become also a book project in the future. So it's entirely new, and so it's really a surface, and I'm not a specialist at all on non-territorial autonomy or RENA, but I really hope, and I'm really happy because already the church was mentioned 4 times or something like that previously, that maybe with my example, which is a non-state actor and was more or less in Austria-Hungary between 1867 and 1918, the most widespread organization, so affecting so many millions of people, which in no way faces another organization or institution as such. So it's rather new. So let's start, and let's start with my clock, so that Boris doesn't need this. He will, okay. So for my introduction, so I can only present today more or less research, votes your questions. So my 3 main research questions, and those of you who already read the paper will soon recognize it differs somehow from the paper I've sent in July. It's just because I was doing more or less nothing else than reflecting upon this new project and also going to the archives already to gain a first overview on which kind of documents do diocese archives have, what can they tell us when you are dealing with the language use. So you will soon recognize, and I've brought some of them with me for today. Maybe some words about the Roman Catholic Church in Austria-Hungary, and I'm focusing at the moment on so-called KK Austria, which already covers lots of languages too, and I'm at the moment not sure if I will also include later Hungary, which I would love to. But on the other hand, and this is really an important argument, when you're dealing with a joint army, which was an organization run jointly, even after the Ausgleich between Austria and Hungary, you have something, you have one ministry which covers all of this double monarchy, which is not the case for the church at all. So even if religious affairs like bishops' appointments were done by the monarch, so in my case Francis Joseph most of the time, it was usually was going through the Ministry of Cultural and Religious Affairs, which was either the Austrian one or the Hungarian one. So at the moment, I'm only dealing with the Austrian part. What is also important to note is, and maybe this is of interest also when it comes to NTA, is that, okay, first of all, it's not a state actor, although very much connected to the ministries and the state, for example, through the so-called religious fund, which meant the state paid a lot of school teachers in religious schools, they paid for some chaplains, etc., etc. So it was somehow state, but it was mostly not. So it was running its own agenda, especially when it comes to language use. What is also important, of course, there was the so-called Bischofskonferenz, which can be called like a regular gathering of all the bishops, but it was not like, and I rushed through their minutes when they met, they were usually not dealing with the language issue or with the nationalities in Austria, which means it was more or less all left to the dioceses, and the dioceses, and this is also really important, is they did not cover in many respects the provincial borders of Habsburg Austria, so they are overlapping. So when it comes to my research questions, and for the moment this makes sense for me, is the organization and the arguments. So which languages were recognized by the dioceses? Why were some languages recognized and others not? And this is also for me very important because I've worked so much about this so-called Landesüblichkeit, so languages had to be recognized in the province to be really used, and only in the case that at a municipality level and goes up to the provincial government that 20% of the population spoke this language, then it had to be recognized. So I'm thinking of when bishops or ordinariates, so the offices of the bishops, recognized the language, did they somehow took into account that they are covering, for example, Carniola or Carinthia, which were bilingual? So did they, when they recognized the languages in the parishes, did they think about the state law? What is also important to say for Habsburg Austria is that in the Austrian constitution, more or less all the languages, as soon as they were recognized languages, had to be taken into account for administration, schools, and the army. Of course, this was not the case that the Roman Catholic institutions had to stick to this fundamental law. But on the other hand, if we think of, can you really escape as church institution when citizens after so many decades were familiar with their fundamental law? So if you really totally do a different policy, adopt a different policy for religious affairs on your territory, probably the citizens won't stay calm for a long time. But this is still a hypothesis, and or better, it already turned in a thesis. So how did they took into account when they organized the language use in the dioceses, the state law, the provincial law, and the fundamental law of the citizens? Or did they adopt their own agenda? I already came across that seemingly sometimes even in Carniola, or in Styria, which Styria was bilingual, German and Slovene, that the whole diocese and connecting offices only operated in German language, which was for me in the Maribor archive a bit of strange when it was only Slovenes writing to one another, but only using German. And when languages were not recognized, why? And also of importance is how did they deal with these so-called languages which were by linguists in the 19th century, but also by the state institution, not treated as language any longer, but still used like Windisch or Friulanisch, so all these languages which were throughout the 19th century called to be a dialect only and not a language. My second point, and I think this is really important, is arguments and politics on human resource and skilled human resource in these days. Back then, with the Roman Catholic Church, were mostly priests. So it wasn't organized as today, where dioceses have lots of. So I always call them. I'm coming from the army, civil employees. So it was usually the priests who worked in the offices and decided. So I'm asking myself, and this also is a question which stems from my army research, is to what extent was already existing language knowledge of the priests taken into account when they were assigned a parish? So, or did they not? Or were they expected to learn the language later? Which was the case, for example, for the army, where the officers had 3 years to learn the new language, which meant that for 3 years they worked with conscripts and they were unable to communicate. So what about the priests and the dioceses? What was the policy to ensure that all languages needed met with enough future personnel? And I would say that the long-term planning was much more necessary in the case of the Roman Catholic Church than in any other institution, because a priest cannot simply be replaced and someone else hired, but he has to go through years and years of, has to become a priest and so on. So it's not like in other professions. So you somehow, as a bishop, you have to think of, okay, these speakers are growing, or due to internal migration, there is more and more Czech speakers in Vienna or in Linz or in Wiener Neustadt. So how can we provide enough priests for the future? Or did they not simply not care at all about this? Complaints and reactions would be my third point, and it's, or in German we always have this nice double nouns, Beschwerdekultur and Umgang mit Beschwerden. So how did the bishops and also the priests in the parishes deal with complaints made by several parties? And of course, the language use in the Roman Catholic Church was also connected to the nationality and language debate in the civil political sphere of Habsburg Austria. And I don't think that the complaints were brought up in a totally different way. This is my theory at the moment, but let's see what else comes up. But how were complaints brought up? How were they argued? By whom? And because language use has always something to do with representation in the public, and let's think about that most of the people lived in rural areas these days. So usually the church was the main point of cultural life in a village or in a smaller town. So as long as, and as soon as their language was not used, it's a matter of representation and cultural public life. So how did the church representatives reacted, and what were their arguments? But also, what is of importance, what if the priests and also bishops were openly acting nationalistic? So for example, priests refusing to do spiritual support in a parish in Slovene, or vice versa in German. So I hope I have shown already that what was really fun when 1 year ago I started with the idea to doing research on the Roman Catholic Church. Usually people reacted in a way, so what, masses were in Latin. That Roman Catholic Church and language use is much more than just masses in Latin. But I've also brought for the next couple of minutes, so whenever, don't count this in. So here, just to show you the wide range of possible sources you can use when dealing with this topic. So here is just from the Catholic Church calendar, how big the Austrian Bishops' Conference of Bishops were. So it went from Galicia in the east and Bukovina down till Dalmatia. So it covered lots of languages and lots of nationalities. What is also important is that some of the dioceses used the local languages that were also used on a provincial level in the Austrian government and administrations, and some not. Usually they adopted then called Anteile, so parts of the diocese, and they somehow, from the organizational point of view, then separated their diocese into, like here, Trento, German and Italian. So it's also about wording. What is also important, and I came across this very often when doing research on the army, it's in the diocese is also totally different when it comes to the language used in the ordinariate, in the bishop's office, and what was used in the parishes. In the parishes they were much more flexible, and maybe this is also an idea with NTA. So they simply reacted on the need. Which made it for them much easier because they were not stick to provincial laws. The bishop just decided. What is also important is outgoing, when they published something, so something about the diocese and what they are doing went publicly. For example, with these Diözesanblätter, the Gazette of the diocese. And I think it's of importance if they used 2 or 3 separate issues, one in German, one in Czech or whatever, or if they decided to do it jointly, then it's also a matter of which language is used first or on the left or above. So it's also something which did not just come or started, but there is always a debate among diocese representatives before they do that. Language use in the Roman Catholic Church also means signage on buildings. So far I've only found this, which comes from Habsburg times, and it's from Ostrava. So it simply says on the left and on the right of the main entrance, like in German, first starting with the church was built and restored, blah, blah, and underneath Czech, and on the right side it's then Czech above German. So this is also something where was a language left out? Was there a debate? Why did the bishop accept this? Or who was responsible to say finally, yes, you are allowed to put this plate on a church and use the languages as such? Public announcements, so all these posters which were a stick to all the parishes. I also thought of, was there only German ones sent to German parishes who use German, or in all the languages or whatsoever. So this is all of concern for my future research. This is an example of Ljubljana. I think it's the original version in the middle, of course in Latin. But it's also of importance because the bishop, although only German was used in his own office and correspondence between him and the parish priests, he started in Czech on the left side. And in the 19th century, it was said that when it's on the left side, it's the dominating language. So this was the practice of the province, some of the provinces, and also the army. Matriken is something we always came across, so pre-printed forms, yes, in which language, both languages, in which language were the first name of the baptized used, was it Germanized or in any other language translated, and this is also something where language use mattered in the dioceses. And then the wide field of human resources. When it comes, so usually bishops were asked if one bishop died or got retired, they were asked to name the best applicants to the Statthalter, so the head of the province. And also here it's a lot about which languages this candidate speaks, if Italians will be satisfied with a Slovene, but who speaks Italian properly, and so on and so on. I have 3 minutes left, I will go through this. I've put this in the German origin because everybody who can read German makes more out of it, and I already said what it's about. And the diocese archives hold a lot of these suggestions for new bishops and the arguments why this would be good and this not. Here is Franz Xaver Nagel, who later became Cardinal of Vienna and Archbishop of Vienna, but he had his first bishop appointment in Trieste. And when he came into discussion, he replied to another bishop like, he doesn't want to do it because he doesn't feel so much capable of doing this, because there is Croatian speakers and Slovene speakers, and he speaks only Italian and German. But then they said, well, it's exactly because of that. You do not belong to any of these quarreling nationalities, so you're the best man for that job. So we can also see it's not always about language knowledge. Or down to assignment of priests to the parishes, and there had been hundreds of, and in every diocese, and it's also always, does this person speak this or that language, or whom do we prefer? Slovene nationalist who speaks barely German over a German who speaks barely Slovene. So it's always these concerns about whom to send where, and it's not always about language knowledge, but it's always about finding out if this person can run especially parishes in villages where people speak more than one language. So is this person capable? And very interestingly, and I end with that, I was really surprised that there was an awareness about all this so-called new Habsburg national indifference debate in the Roman Catholic dioceses before 1918. I still have to dig deeper, but there was a so-called pastoral conference on diocese level in 1898, and one of the three main questions they dealt with is how should the priest do spiritual warfare in nationally and confessionally mixed parishes? So there was a whole conference debating about awareness, about linguistically mixed parishes, nationality mixed parishes. And this is also like then the outcomes, still have to dig for the debate. And what is also really of interest even more is how did the question itself became part of the program to be discussed, because usually in the Habsburg monarchy, when they come up with something like that, there was already a debate going on. But before they decided, now we have to give in, we have to find a solution. So, but I was really surprised that there's so much awareness about this topic. Conclusion. I think if I compare it with the army and with provincial governments, it's like, in theory, the Roman Catholic Church institutions could have been much more flexible when it comes to the recognition of languages than state institutions, because they were not so much dependent on the fundamental law and on provincial laws, which does not mean that it worked properly all the time in Habsburg Austria, but at least you always had to argue from the province and administrative and bureaucratic side. But on the other hand, even when they're flexible, this usually allows that you have it much easier to marginalize one language over another, because just the bishop says, and it has to be done. So what is also of importance is, and I was aware of that a couple of months ago, is that how much effort has been spent on providing enough language-skilled personnel for the future, and how much this was debated in the dioceses, and how they should act in these mixed parishes. And what is maybe also of interest for the conference is, what I found interesting is this, that they somehow decided there is this lingua franca, but we somehow flexible react on the need in the village when there is a Czech-speaking parish coming up, then we will of course provide enough translations and priests for this newly appearing parish. If I think of all these pleas of Czech speakers in Vienna who made up really a high percentage in Vienna finally to become their language recognized in Vienna or in Law Austria back then, and then it was just simply said, yeah, you're not an historic language in this region. For the church it was much easier because they didn't have to go through all these institutions. What was also really interesting, this is my last word, is that seemingly they were really free hand given in the dioceses. So usually there were complaints made in the Vatican, but simply they just decided on their own. So which also meant that politics on how to use languages and when and where could immediately change when the bishop changed. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. We do it like in the first panel, so I will now present the second speaker and the third, and then we will have the discussion and the comments in the end. So I have the honor to present our second speaker, who is Olena Palko, who is an assistant professor at the University of Basel, quite recently. So my dearest congratulations. So after having, before she was at Birkbeck College in London, so very recently there, and she was already one of our guest researchers last year, and I'm very happy that she is back with us again, and I'm very much looking forward to your paper on non-territorial arrangements in interwar Soviet Ukraine, and you're looking on the judiciary. You have 20 minutes.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And I just would say that this paper was actually, I never thought of writing this paper. I had some material for this study, but it was actually last September, I believe, when I was here in Vienna discussing my other research with the NTA team, that I received this invite for this conference, and then I kind of started thinking about what I actually have to present and to write about. And then I remember that I have some documents about those kind of the arrangement of judicial network during the interwar period, during the Koronization in Ukraine. And indeed, I'm not a specialist on the NTA, like the non-territorial autonomy, but our discussion last year and then my research made me kind of think about those arrangements that were there during the interwar decades in Ukraine. And I'm really looking forward to Boris, your comments, because I remember what you said last year. So it's kind of interesting to see if I actually found those arrangements in what I was researching. So it's especially interesting to discuss the Soviet case study because the Soviet leaders, as some of you may know, they were actually opposing the non-territorial arrangements. Lenin even said that national cultural or non-territorial autonomy is the most refined and the most dangerous form of nationalism. And obviously, nationalism was something the Soviets did not accept or decided to, or kind of wanted to fight against. And the Bolsheviks, they favored territorial autonomy, they favored strong state, they favored what they called kind of the democratic centralism, which, like in their idea, territorial autonomy did not contradict this democratic centralism because it could only strengthen the structure of the state. And here is a lengthy quote from Stalin, which I will not read, but basically in this quote he kind of shows the benefits of the territorial autonomy, the territorial arrangements when dealing with various national minorities, in contrast to those non-territorial arrangements which were there in the Austro-Marxist approach. And actually this work, the 1913 work by Stalin, Marxism and the National Question, was aimed to discredit the Austro-Marxist approach. The Bolsheviks, they from the very beginning, from 1917, they promised to grant equality and protect the rights of all minorities within the former Russian Empire. In practice, what it meant is the linguistic equality, the linguistic visibility, that every national minority or ethnic community would have the right to use their language in all relations with the state. And the linguistic equality was guaranteed in a number of legal documents. And here I just put a few of them, mainly because they concern the main topic of my presentation, the judicial arrangements for, like the establishment of a judicial network for minority population. So already in 1923, in the document on measures for guaranteeing the equality of languages and for aiding the development of the Ukrainian language, Ukrainian and Russian were recognized as two state languages, and which should be used in all kind of aspects when dealing with the state, except for the regions where ethnic populations dominate. And this was later reiterated in 1927 document with the same title. But what is interesting that in 1927 only Ukrainian was featured as the official language, so they dropped Russian already. And the document from 1927 is very interesting because it has a separate section on the judiciary measures, so basically how to ensure the equality of languages in the judiciary sphere. And what they say that, so again, they reiterated that everyone has the right to communicate with the state in their languages, and kind of the state should create national courts or courts in national languages in those territorial units where national minorities dominate. But for those residing outside of those national territorial units, field sessions of circuit courts or vyezní sessions should be created. And with those measures, they were also reflected in the criminal procedure code and the civil procedure codes. And basically, this became not just a desire or declaration or kind of recommendation, it became an obligation of the court to provide access for each and every person to access the court and for their case to be heard in their native language. When we speak about korenizacija, we should think about, again, like this kind of preference to territorial arrangements within the Soviet Union, and this is what Terry Martin and Grigor Suni call territorialization of ethnicity. So basically, with the new administrative reform in the 1920s, the new administrative reform was based on the ethnic lines, and according to which each national group would have a territory of their own. And here on this map, this is a very useful resource from the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. On this map, you can see the designated national rayons or districts for national minorities in those regions with compact settlement of those minority representatives. And in general, there were 53 districts or okrug, and I think here you can see that how many of them were created for ethnic minorities. So within those national districts, everything was supposed to be in the minority language. So the schooling, even access to medical help, judiciary, like law enforcement facilities. So everything was supposed to function in the minority language. But obviously, when we think about the diversity of Ukraine, those minority representatives, they did not only live within those regions. There were a lot of representatives outside of these areas. And this is what is basically where non-territorial arrangements come into play. Just to say so, to merit a court based on this territorial principle, there need to be a minimum of 10,000 and later changed to 8,000 nationals within an administrative unit to merit a national court. But this was obviously not easy to achieve because if you even think about those areas, those national units, sometimes you have population of only 15,000 people within the national district, out of which 50 or 60% can be representatives of a minority. So it was really, those arrangements were hard to follow, and this is, I would argue, where those non-territorial arrangements come to play, and sometimes, or most times, they are against the official declarations. This is how people on the ground were trying to translate the directives from the center, because the center, the authorities, they preferred the territorial principle, but at the same time, they demanded reports on successes of the implementing this policy. And sometimes on the ground, you have a lot of flexibility how people approached those directives, how they decided to implement those directives. Sometimes, and there are cases from the archives when you see that people were allowed to come to use the court from outside the national district when actually it was extraterritorial jurisdiction of that court, when everyone of the Polish minority, for instance, could come to the Polish the court in Marchlewsk, Polish Autonomous District, and basically have his case heard. But I should go back to the script. But it was actually very difficult to establish a court, a national court. First, the initiative should come from, so to say, a non-governmental organization. But in the Jewish case, it was the Yiddish court. So it was the Yevsektia, or the kind of Jewish Jewish bureau of the Jewish department of the party who would come up with the idea, and then they would popularize the idea among the people, so to get some public support to the idea. Then they would bring this idea to the attention of the local authorities, who would then demand the statistical survey of the region to actually find out how many, the numerical dynamic in the region, to understand what was the minority, whether there could be a Jewish, a Polish, or a German court, and so on and so on. And if there was more than 50% of the nationals of this minority, then they would sort of endorse their application, and then the application would go to the agencies, the state agencies in charge of the minority policies. And in Ukraine, this was the Central Commission on National Minorities. And I was lucky enough to get access to some archival documents from Khmelnytsky, from Proskuri, where they actually basically discuss how to establish this court, and where you can see the calculation, how many people were there in this particular community, and so on and so on. Yes, this was the process. But actually it was, at first it was very difficult to establish those national courts. Because when you think about the context of the civil war in 1921-22, this was really not the time to establish the developed network of national courts. There were no codes to speak of. There was kind of there was this idea of revolutionary justice, that there was no need for law altogether. And only after 1924, when the Soviet authority started to consolidate their power, they started to develop those policies. So on this slide, you can see the increase in number of national courts throughout Ukraine. And basically, when in 1924 there were only 9 of those courts, and in 1931 there were already 90 courts. But it is interesting that while the number of national courts increased, the number of investigating magistrates and local law enforcement units, which were really like the prerequisite of the success of this policy, they lagged far behind. So in 1933 there were only 11 investigation departments. So you can see the discrepancy between the courts and the implementation of the policy, but at the same time how different agencies worked at kind of crossroads against each other. When one is doing something more, another are lagging behind, and at the end, this is what I would argue kind of led to the failure of this policy altogether. So national popular tribunals, they encompass both criminal and civic cases, and in particular they looked at cases of local concerns, but it is of note that most of those cases had also very high propaganda value in the eyes of the Soviet authorities. And it is interesting that a lot of courts were established for the Jewish minority. You can see that there were like 46 courts in Yiddish, and these were like 67% of all the national courts in Soviet Ukraine. And this is not by accident, because there were a lot of, the Jewish community was quite numerical in Ukraine. I believe it was almost 1.5 million according to 1926 census. But at the same time, Jews were hardly engaged in this process of territorialization of ethnicities. There were only 3 national autonomous regions created for Jews, and they only encompass some 60,000 Jews. So basically, when the Soviet authorities failed to territorialize Jews, so to say, they implemented another initiative, how to reach out, how to bring this kind of Soviet spirit to the Jewish communities with the introduction of this Yiddish-speaking courts, and creating these courts, kind of trying to break the communities, to penetrate those close-knit communities of like Jewish communities, and offer an alternative to those rabbinical courts, and so on. I kind of already lost what I wanted to say. No, I'm kind of not following, and then it's difficult to go back. Basically, as I said, the territorial principle was the key principle for organizing those courts. But at the same time, in 1929, only 1/3 of national courts were established in the autonomous national districts. So most of those courts were established within national village councils. It's basically a village Soviet and a national collective farm, and within those villages there were those popular courts established. But it meant that those courts were also used by the mixed population outside of those small communities, of those villages. And the main challenge, the practical challenge, was how to make it work. So how to serve the kind of ethnically homogeneous population of this village and ethnically heterogeneous population of outside of this village. So practical solutions were, as for instance, to create 2 parallel chambers within one town or a village, or to create facultative or optional procedures in the minority languages within a bilingual district court. But there was always a problem that you needed to mirror all the processes into languages. You needed to have the personnel who would work in both languages at the same time. Or there was also an approach to have fully extraterritorial chambers or combination of territorial and extraterritorial changes. So these were practical solutions which often were frowned upon by the authorities, and at every meeting of the minority specialists at the kind of governmental level, they were criticizing those extraterritorial arrangements, those non-territorial arrangements, because it meant lack of control. It meant the state was not able to basically, the state always wanted to keep control in its hands. And if something is non-territorial, if it's not within the kind of this hierarchy or the vertical of power, then is lack of control. And this is why they were always kind of protesting against it. They say, yes, of course, we can, in this way, we can reach wider communities, but we need to think about the need for control and the need for the state authority at each particular location. Yeah, I'm not gonna speak about that. So I'm just gonna speak a little bit very quickly about the motivations, why it was important, why the Soviet authorities even went ahead with this reform, because as you can imagine, it was quite costly, and it was a lot of efforts to create the whole structure, the judicial structure in minority languages, not only Ukrainian but also like let's say 5 most widely used languages in Ukraine, and motivation was kind of pragmatic, but at the same time, this was part of the propaganda effort of the Soviet authorities. They wanted to present themselves as in opposition to the imperial authorities, which operated on the basis of this ethnic bias, when there were Russians, Orthodox Russians, which were prioritized everywhere in the empire, and the Bolsheviks wanted to present themselves as those promoting equality and the rights of each and every national group within the Soviet Union. But at the same time, such a structure could provide them with some sort of legitimacy on the ground, because more and more people would turn to the Soviet regime, would support the Soviet regime, because they would see that the Soviet regime really kind of provides for their rights and their interests. There was also an important educational role, but this comes also with propaganda, that through courts, and actually judges were expected to speak out to people, to write articles, to basically also act as educators, as mouthpiece of the propaganda, and so on and so on. And there was also an interesting function, especially in the case of Jews and Poles, when a lot of those courts were actually conducting trials against so-called kulaks, so those better off villagers, kind of forcing them to basically kind of showing that it was about their social status, taking off their possessions, and it was as a punitive function to turn those people into lishenцы, into disfranchised people. Basically, this was, again, one of the propaganda efforts of the regime. And there was something interesting I found in the archives, where they were saying that Jews were actually Jewish lawyers, those old Jewish lawyers that were advising their community against turning to those courts, because as they were saying, these are not Jewish courts, but Soviet courts conducting proceedings in the Yiddish language. So the interest of the state was always predominant. It was the interest of the state and not the interest of the community which was at stake here. And just very briefly about the challenges. So the challenges were enormous for the authorities, and actually since they were unable to solve those challenges, this led to the downfall and kind of the failure of the entire project. There was lack of qualified personnel, and sometimes there was only one, say, Greek or Moldovan speaking judge, and when he retired or for any other reason, there was no reserve. They could not replace the judge, so basically the entire court would be just dissolved, just because there would be no other to replace this person. And it was not only about the language, it was also about the correct social background, right? Because we are speaking about the Soviet state. The judge needed to have a right political background, like kind of to have a clear, ideologically kind of correct career, and so on and so on. Then there was insufficiently developed legal and judicial terminology. Even by the end of the 1920s, only 2 codes were translated into minority languages, one into Bulgarian and one into Yiddish, which also kind of tells us a lot, right? How a court can even function if there is no vocabulary or terminology to rely on. And in many cases, judges were not even able to properly speak the language of the court, of the minority they represented. There were a lot of complaints about the Polish judges who could not really lead the case properly in the Polish language. And and basically just to say that in the 1930s, the whole project kind of came to naught, because there were two sort of factors leading to it. There was obviously modernization, and with modernization, a lot of people moved out of their initial close communities to cities. So there were less and less people who would address the court in the national language within those localities. And the state was not really interested in practical aspects of this reform. They wanted it on paper, but at the same time, there were so many challenges that it seemed that they were not providing enough resources to make it function properly. And as there were less and less cases referred to those courts, the criticism increased. And at some point, already in 1930s, the new administrative reform was implemented, and it was basically became impossible to have parallel jurisdiction of several courts within the same rayon, and all courts merged with the idea that it would be that the courts would provide the main language would be the official language of the Republic, so Ukrainian, and those people not understanding the language, they would have the right for an interpreter. But there was no provision anymore for a separate national People's Tribunal or this national court. And later on, the same was reiterated in the Soviet and later Soviet Ukrainian constitution, when basically they enabled any provision of this kind. Thank you.
Olena. I have the joy to introduce our third speaker on this panel, Viktoria Gerasimova, who is a senior research fellow and the head of the laboratory for the study of Jewish civilization at Austria State University. And what is very interesting, before she came to studying what she's presenting today, she worked on Jewish converts in the 18th century in the Russian Empire, and not necessarily on Siberia, where she focused now, and where we also have a Jewish minority, and she will talk about this.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Boris, for the introduction. And first of all, I would like to thank the NTA team, the committee of the conference, for having us here and to giving us a chance to be a part of international academic community. That's very important to be heard and seen even now. And I also want to mention that the logo of our panel is I'm not a specialist in NTA. So I'm not a specialist too. I'm much more in Jewish studies than in NTA issues. And my focus in the paper will be more on the implementation and the arrangement of the idea in a very specific, narrow context. And the last but not least, I'm not as fluent in English as my colleagues are, so I will stick to my paper, not to be too slow. So my presentation will deal more with the idea, not the idea, but the implementation of NTA, and I will consider it in several specific contexts. One of them, I will talk about a remote Siberian region, Russian eastern outskirts, so-called Okrayina, on the one hand, and on the other hand, I will discuss the idea of Jewish and implementation of Jewish national autonomy in Siberia. So I will talk about minority in minority in a very specific geographical context. And the third context will be the biographical one, and I will discuss these through the biography of one of the most influential Jewish leaders in Siberia, Abram Kishnets. This quite a narrow perspective will allow me to answer the question of what role the Jewish NTA idea of autonomy played in a region with a small Jewish population in incredible ethnic and confessional diversity, and how personal impact of one Jewish leader influenced it. Well, in 1916, a series of articles appeared in Moscow Jewish journal Novy Put. These articles, authored by someone called Susanin, offered to his readers a rather sad picture of Jewish life in Siberia. I quote, "Jewish cultural and ethnic life in Siberia is rather poor. One can only speak of the first glimmers of national consciousness among Siberian Jewry. The Jewish community and the Jewish national ideology of the Siberian Jews are still in their formative stages and are only crystallizing," end of quote. According to Susanin, the Siberian Jews implemented the masculine model of identity and became the Siberians of the Mosaic law. They were Jews only at home and in synagogue, and in other cases completely merged with the surrounding population. Of course, from Susanin's ideological point of view, all this looked like degeneration and loss of national identity. The Siberian Jews, according to Susanin, were alien to the social, political, and national cultural agenda of the Jews or the European part of the empire. They saw no difference between Talmud and Sholem Aleichem, between Hebrew and Yiddish, which obviously indicated the degree of their separation from Jewry in general. Well, I decided to show you the picture of the Trans-Siberian Magistral just to map the communities I will talk about and to show you the main communities, the main cities where the Jewish communities were. And I just mentioned Omsk, Krasnoyarsk, Tomsk, which is not here, but we keep it in mind, Irkutsk and Chita, for instance. Indeed, Siberia had never been a traditional place of residence for Jews. Thousands of kilometers away from the Pale of Settlement, for most Jews, even in the early 20th century, it remained an unknown and mysterious territory associated with exile and punishment. But were they really so culturally poor and backward as Susanin wrote? By the end of the 19th century, Jewish communities lived in all big cities of Siberia. The percentage of Jewish population was comparable to those in the large cities of European Russia outside the Pale. They read Jewish newspapers from all over the world, donated to Jewish international organizations, built their institutions trying to base them not at the image of the Pale, but at the European Jewish traditions. And just to entertain the public and to illustrate my idea, I want to show you the image and the original, we have here a synagogue from Omsk, and here a synagogue from Leopoldstadt, which is known, for locals especially. And as researchers, and I refer here to Dr. Vladimir Levin and Dr. Anna Berezin from the Center for Jewish Art at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, they found this copy, like the idea of copying of the best European Jewish architecture in Siberia, actually. So Was it an outskirt? Was it a Jewish outskirt? We don't know. The beginning of the public discussion about Siberia as a possible center for the migration of Jews during First World War was the Congress of Representatives of the Jewish Committee of Aid of the Victims of the War at the end of August 1915. Boris Brutzkus, a prominent Jewish scientist, while talking about the economic perspectives of the New Pale, drew attention to the Siberian region. The question of the resettlement of Jews to Siberia immediately took on the character of a general discussion about the prospects of resettlement of Russian Jewry. Responding to numerous critics, Brutzkus emphasized the global nature of his idea, as far-reaching as external immigration and not too reducible only to the issue of settlement of refugees here and now. The Brutzkus plan was the impetus for a public discussion of Siberia as a possible center for Jewish immigration. Previously invisible, Siberian Jews became an object of attention for their brethren from the Pale. The Jews of the European part of the empire compared Siberian realities with their usual way of life. Some of the outsiders who found themselves in Siberia, like Susanin, discovered numerous differences from their usual understanding of Jewish lifestyle. Some of them, like Abram Kishnets and many others, became a part of local Jewish elite and tried to influence the Jewish population of Siberia. The Jews of Siberia were not too much involved in the Jewish national movement in the first decade of the 20th century. The process of consolidation of Siberian Jewry and recognition of its unity as a social and political force received a powerful impulse during the first years of the First World War. The necessity to accumulate and redistribute funds for the support of refugees, displaced persons, and the prisoners of war, as well as to make joint decisions, forced the local communities to search for the ways of communication and effective methods of interaction with each other. During the next 2 years after February 1917, the Siberian Jewry experienced the brightest stage of its national life. The main suppliers of revolutionary idea, including the ideas of the Jewish Socialist Party Bund, were of course political exiles. This is how Abram Kishnets ended up, This is how Abram Kishnets ended up in Siberia. A member of Bund party since 1905, he was exiled to Eastern Siberia in 1915. Unlike Susanin, the author of critical articles on the miserable state of the Jewish national life in Siberia, Kishnets was rather quickly incorporated into the local social life, both Jewish and non-Jewish, becoming a prominent figure in the intellectual cycles of Irkutsk. Coming from a wealthy Hasidic family, Kishnets received both a traditional Jewish education and a secular education. Long before his exile, Kishnets began his career as a journalist and bibliographer, and you can see just a few samples of his works, measured in Russian. Having found himself in Siberia in the midst of the First World War, Abram Kishnets immediately became involved in Jewish social work. He became a representative of two important all-Russian organizations of this period, the Jewish Committee of Aid to Victims of War, so-called YKPO, and the Society of Craft Labor, so-called ORT. That's why he had first-hand knowledge of how Jewish communities in Siberia were organized. Unlike many other Jewish public figures, he personally inspected a large part of the settlements. He also had family ties with local Jews. In Irkutsk, he married the daughter of local rabbi, being a Bundist. As Osip Meir, exiled to Siberia from Warsaw, recalled, it was Kishnets who stood at the origins of the first Bund group in Irkutsk in 1915. Despite all efforts and the existence of Bund groups, in all the major Siberian towns, the socialists were not very popular with the Jewish local population. Their audience was mainly refugees from the western part of the former Russian Empire, while the local Siberian Jews were closer to the Zionists, who offered a broad pan-democratic program. The political landscape of Jewish Siberia was not diverse, and all groups broadcast autonomist ideas in one or another way. For 2 years after the revolution, Siberian Jews were integrated into the all-Russian political agenda. One of the main issues was the discussion of communal autonomy. As Simon Rabinovich showed us, all the political active groups of the Jewish intelligentsia in the Russian Empire were concerned with the reform and restoration of communal autonomy. So did Siberian Jews. Choosing the Petrograd model of the democratization, Siberian communities started the process of reorganization in 1917, but it took quite a long time. The Siberian Jews could not participate in the All-Russian Congress held in Moscow in 1918 because of the civil war. Nevertheless, the need to decide the national fate of the Jews in Siberia was understood by all the Jewish public and political figures in the region. It was decided to organize a regional convention, the Congress of Jewish Communities of Siberia and the Urals. It was held in Irkutsk in 1919, and its aim was to, I quote, create both a local and all-Jewish national work. As Irina Nam and Natalia Naumova put it, the Congress laid the foundation of extraterritorial autonomy for the Jews in Siberia. The elected National Council declared itself as a national political representation of all Jews of Siberia and the Urals. However, not everyone agreed with this decision. The Congress of the communities disappointed the non-Zionist political groups. Everything, including the interior of the hall in which the Congress was held, stated the Zionist ideological dominance. The hall was decorated with the white and blue flags, and a large portrait of Zionist leader Theodor Herzl was there. After the Zionists and sympathizers were elected to the board of the council, a group of social democrats left the Congress. In his speech at the Congress before leaving it, a representative of the Irkutsk Jewish Workers' Club Zukunft stated, "Here, in our opinion, the foundation of the Siberian Jewish autonomy should be laid, for which the Jewish workers, together with the democratic intelligentsia, fought and shed their blood. Unfortunately, however, we have to state that this Congress is obviously not the one for which we have suffered." Kirchner claimed that the Congress took one step forward and 2 steps back in the Jewish self-government. One of the most important questions under discussion was the national language. The local Siberian Jews switched to the Russian language long ago and used it both outside and inside the community. The knowledge of any Jewish language, Hebrew or Yiddish, was obviously a problem even for the local Jewish leaders. This led to very sensitive situations, giving rise to criticism from political opponents, first of all from Bund. For example, the secretary of the Congress, delegate from the Omsk Zionist Gidali Gitelson, could not read the names of the speakers on the submitted note. They were written in Hebrew, and he couldn't read it. One of the most remarkable and ambitious projects among the Jewish cultural initiatives in Siberia was the Siberian Jewish Cultural League, created in spring 1919. Although the organizers did not refer it, it is obvious that the Siberian League was the analog of the Jewish Cultural League established in Kiev at the beginning of 1918. It was an association of artists, writers, filmmakers, and publishers who promoted the development of Jewish culture in Yiddish. Similar cultural leagues emerged in early 1919 in Petrograd, Minsk, Grodno, Vilna, Rostov-na-Donu, and other cities. In early 1919, in Irkutsk, the first Jewish Workers' Club in Siberia, Zukunft, which means future in Yiddish, opened for Jewish workers in Yiddish. The chairman of the board of this club was Abram Kishnets. The opening of the club was the first step in launching a large-scale cultural program which brought together intellectual democratic forces in various Siberian cities. In the same year, a collection of articles with the same name, Zukunft, was published, which became a kind of public manifesto of Jewish social democracy. And as you can see, it was published, well, in Russian, not in Yiddish. It was published in Russian because Siberian leaders of Bund and other socialistic groups didn't have any printing supplies for publishing in Yiddish. By the way, their opponents, Zionists, did have these supplies, and successfully published their textbooks in Hebrew and so on. The author of the keynote article of the Siberian Cultural League was Abram Kishnets. The league set as its goals at the development of the Jewish secular culture in Yiddish language, how, I don't know, and the geographical area of its work was the territory from the Ural to the Far East, from Chelyabinsk to Harbin. It's a huge territory. And if you'll go back for a second, well, you can imagine it's thousands of kilometers. That was one of the problems of the Jewish leaders. The league planned to open branches all over Siberia, to organize its own publishing house, as well as an own periodical, a literary, scientific, and public journal. Just a sec. But in March 1920, Soviet power was established in Irkutsk, and that was the end of the story. At that time, the member of the board of the National Council of Jewish Communities of Siberia and the Ural, included its chairman, Novomeysky, left for Harbin. Abram Kishnets was caught by the advent of Soviet power in Irkutsk, where he enjoyed the widest of authority. As noted by the Irkutsk functionaries of the Jewish section Yevsektia of the Provincial Committee of the Russian Communist Party of Bolsheviks, I quote, "He is the only Jewish proletarian cultural worker and a popular orator who enjoys great influence among the Jewish workers," end of quote. Nevertheless, he did not join the Bolsheviks and left for Chita, the capital of the Far Eastern Republic, in the end of the 1920s. Bund lost its struggle in Irkutsk, but still there was a chance in a buffer zone in Chita. The national question occupied an important place in the political agenda of the Far Eastern Republic. The largest national groups here were the Mongol, Buryats, Koreans, Ukrainians, and Chinese. The Jews, although not as numerous, nevertheless played an important role in the struggle of national minorities for their rights. The formation of the DVR, the Far East Republic, was completed in the spring of 1921. And it was that then Abram Kishnets entered the assembly of the Republic as a candidate of the Bund. Immediately after his election, Kishnets joined the Commission of Native Affairs to represent the interest of the Jewish minority there. The national minority deputies had to assert the rights of their groups to self-determination. Thus, as a representative of the Bund, a party with its own program of autonomy and extensive experience in social and political activity, Kishnets was an important political actor in the development of a general program of self-determination of national minorities and the extraterritorial autonomy enshrined in the Constitution of the Republic. After the Republic's incorporation into the SFSR, Kishnets left for Novonikolaevsk in 1923, apparently coming to terms with the political defeat of the Bund. In a year, he moved to Moscow and actively joined the new political agenda. In the following years, Kishnets found himself among those who actively promoted the mass resettlement of Jewish laborers to the Far East. He unconditionally supported the establishment of the Jewish territorial autonomy in the Azerbaijan. Further fate of Abram Kishnets was quite typical for many Soviet citizens of the late 1930s. In 1938, Kishnets was arrested and persecuted on a trumped-up case of selling the Far East to the Japanese. He was not killed. He was released in 1940, but his health was broken and he could no longer be restored. He passed away. As his son David recalled, his father's funeral was attended by the most prominent representatives of Soviet Jewish literature, like Peretz Markesh, David Berglisson, Samuel Galkin, Lev Kvetko. While representing a powerful and political and cultural force, Kishnets and his colleagues were nevertheless unable to secure mass support for the Jewish population in Siberia. This was due both to the small number of the Jewish proletariat beyond the Urals and to the mismatch between the Bund's program and the specifics of the national aspirations of the Siberian Jews. reliance on a class approach, the exclusively secular nature of community, and the spread of Yiddish as the main national language proved unattractive to the modernized and largely assimilated Jews of Siberia. As we know, many of the first Bund leaders like Vladimir Medem, Isaiah Eisenstadt, and others spoke Russian, not Yiddish. Bund had to speak Yiddish because the Jewish street spoke it. In Siberia, Jewish languages, both Hebrew and Yiddish, were ideological tools, not the language of the Jewish population itself. This fact created the gap between Jewish intellectual elite and the population. The fragmentation of the Jewish elites in Siberia and this gap between them and the population led to the failure for the struggle for the national cultural interests for the Jewish minority during the first year of the Soviet regime. All further plans for the organization of national Jewish life in the USSR were associated with territorial projects from which the Siberian Jews were essentially excluded and doomed to slow assimilation. Thank you, sir, for your attention.
Thank you to all three speakers for your papers. What I will try now is I will put my finger on the places where I see the non-territorial arrangements and the hidden arrangements maybe. And I think it was nice because I could detect them in all your papers, and I also find it nice because you touched upon things where all three of you came together. You jointly had Jews, and you will talk. You have jurisdictions in common, or jurisdictions that go beyond. Yeah, I will start with Tamara's paper. Tamara Scheer investigates, from my point of view, a very important institution that is quite rarely studied in the context of national minority accommodation, at least in the way Tamara does it. Yeah, the Roman Catholic Church. This is interesting for two reasons, I think. We know, of course, the role of churches, and in particular of priests, as a stronghold of national movements. We think about Polishness and the Roman Catholic Church during the times of partitions, or the importance of the Greek Catholic Church for Ruthenians. And on the other hand, what I find very striking, and maybe you will elaborate on this in the future, many advocates of non-territorial autonomy made this allusion to the church and said, well, exactly what used to be this unity of the church and the state is what we need to break up for the nation to be separated from the state. But nobody seems to look at the Catholic Church as one of those institutions that in itself has to deal and has to accommodate linguistic diversity. So this is where Tamara comes in, and I'm very much looking forward how it will develop in further times. Certainly, and here I totally agree with you, the Catholic Church in Austria-Hungary as a whole, so not the Catholic clergy in Galicia, but the church as a whole, they certainly needed to have a more pragmatic approach to national diversity, because they had to serve and take care of people, pastoral care of people from many different nationalities, and they needed priests who had the ability to understand and to speak to the believers. So these linguistic obstacles had to be overcome. So the basic idea to provide additional languages is something very intrinsic, I think, to the church interest. I think most interestingly, from a non-territorial autonomy perspective are certainly those cases where you talk about jurisdictions that integrate, that go beyond their own jurisdiction in order to serve people outside of the monolingual jurisdiction to serve them in their language. This of course reminded me of the judicial districts that were also in Olena's case, where the judicial districts of the Polish autonomous rayon, the judges there were responsible also for people outside, and maybe we could find the same thing with the parishes. What I did not always understand is where when you talked about jurisdictions and additional, or were there parishes added to these other jurisdictions, or were there people added to these other jurisdictions? So was, if we had the diocese, let's say, of Linz, no, Linz is not a good, let's take Budjovice, so where the German-speaking priests, they're also responsible for a little village outside where they also spoke German, or was the priest there only responsible for the other village, but only for the German speakers there? So this, because there we come back to the question: is it the personality principle, or is it the territoriality principle? So this would be one of the questions I have for you. And the other thing that I was wondering is if you all non-territorial autonomy arrangements somehow address the group, so you have to know who belongs to the group. And I would be interested whether the Catholic Church or these dioceses, whether they ever tried to count what languages their believers do speak, not in order to categorize them in a statistical sense, but in order to know what they need. I didn't see it in you showed some slides there. I didn't see it very well, but I think there was, the category language was not there. But it would be interesting to see, because you know very well that the national registers and all these things was a big topic in the Habsburg Empire, and was it also for the Catholic Church? And then I have but this is more this is not very important, but I find you might know more about this. There was a Corinthian Slovene pastor, Matija Majar, who I think in the 1860s proposed a non-territorial autonomy model that was later allegedly read by Edwin Christian. So it would be interesting. And Matija Majar was from Hermagor, Schmohar, and he was a pastor. So maybe there is also a link. So I found it very interesting. So I found these non-territorial arrangements clearly there. More provocative, or it's not a provocative question, but so I prefer to talk about arrangements and not of autonomy, because I think such a structurally, intrinsically hierarchical institution like the Roman Catholic Church, there is no space for autonomy, but because the very idea of autonomy is not inherent. If we could maybe talk about autonomy, then maybe the Greek Catholic Church had some autonomous structures, but this is another story. So let's move on to Olena, who how wonderfully demonstrated how in interwar Soviet Ukraine these national territorialization processes were paralleled with these non-territorial arrangements in the case you brought up in the judicial sphere. And I think it's why they came to this solution is because the Soviets themselves, they realized that their idea of creating always smaller and smaller and smaller territorial units, it never comes to an end. So it is unsolvable. They found these non-territorial arrangements, in this case in the judicial system. And you were also talking and showing this statistics where we actually see that there were less minority courts in the autonomous raioni than they were outside. So here, and Tamara, I'm sure you have your ears wide open. Here, I think that's very clearly a non-territorial approach to this. Two questions arose from your paper. On the one, somewhere in your paper, you wrote that local people criticized that they did not wish to have local national councils in one and the same city. And I was wondering, are they criticizing something that does already exist? Because if you have in one and the same city, you have a Polish council and a Ukrainian council, then of course you have you also have a non-territorial regime in a city. And so I was wondering whether they are criticizing this or whether they just say it in general, no, this is something we don't want. This could look like Austro-Marxism, which of course they would have to say, no, this cannot be. When you were talking about the judicial system as an instrument of Bolshevik power, yes, that's certainly true. I think it's in a way quite normal. All state institutions always try to work in favor of the state, and in this case of a totalitarian state. What I find interesting is that you said that these courts enjoyed little popularity, and I actually believe you, but I would be interested in how you can measure this unpopularity, and this is also something that goes later to Viktoria, where you hardly have elections. I mean, I think there were once elections in Siberia, but how do you... the Bundists would also say the Zionists were not popular, and the Zionists always said the Bundists were not popular. So I would be interested in how you measure this. And for the courts, I would also wonder what were the alternatives. I mean, yes, for Jews and for Muslims, you have a tradition of rabbinical courts and Muslim traditional courts, but where could Bulgarians go, or Greek, so they could basically, and not all settlements that you bring before a court are ideological. If you sue your neighbor because the neighbor killed your cow, then there is very little ideology, and where could they turn to? Yeah, I have many more questions, but I will be too long. So then let me say a couple of words to Viktoria Gerasimova's paper. You sketched the activities of these Jewish activists in Siberia. What I find very striking is that you rightly said that Kirchnitz and also the Zionists had to adapt to the realities of Siberia, which is clear. But I was wondering, you hardly talked about it. If I remember correctly, Kirchnitz was one of the authors of the law of non-territorial autonomy in the Far Eastern Republic. So he brought his expertise that he gathered from his time before he came to Siberia, and then maybe also the time when he was in the Siberian Jewish Congress, which he did not like because it was dominated by Zionists, but still he might have understood something that he brought into his expertise when he then was in the Far Eastern Republic. And there is something that's more question that a problem that I always have, but maybe the others also have. For me, it's always very complicated to understand when you talk about Siberia. Where is Siberia? You showed the map, and sometimes it's Tomsk, sometimes it's Irkutsk, then it's Chito or Vladivostok. So because this first Siberian Jewish Congress did not cover all of Siberia, and definitely the Far Eastern Republic did not cover Tomsk. So I think you sometimes need to be more helpful to those who are not so familiar with Siberia or the Far East in the revolutionary period. What I will end with this, I find very interesting is Kirschnitz as a person. Because he seemed to be able to do everything and nothing. So he started as a Bundist, but and he knew obviously about non-territorial autonomy, not least he could not write it into the constitution. But I find him very un-Bundist in a way that he, well, first, he is so much interested in this resettlement program, which is not the big aim of the Bund. The Bund does not want to resettle big populations. Okay, they are open for industrialization and migration that comes with it, but no resettlement programs. And the other thing that he became so inclined with this Birobidzhan project is also quite astonishing. I mean, Olena mentioned the Yevsektia. Of course, they later turned towards Birobidzhan, but the Yevsektia was an institution that was acting mostly non-territorially. And of course, there were some Yevsektia members who then also did Birobidzhan, but he seems to go directly towards the Birobidzhan idea. So I found him very territorial for somebody who's coming from a party that is known for its non-territoriality, and it's a pity that Ronny Gechtmann is not here, who of course knows this much better than I do. I will stop here. I hope you remember the comments, but I also want to give now the floor to the others, and then we do it like the last time, that we bring these questions in together. So, who raises? I think Sabine was the... yeah.
Thank you very much for the very interesting papers. And I have a question for Olena. If I put it in a provocative way, I would say that at the end, the conclusion of your paper is that language doesn't matter. Because in a way, you have all these sophisticated policies done by the Soviet in order to do the language a tool for a social engineering. I mean, for propagandistic tool and a way to fight against the bourgeoisie and for the people. But at the end, as you show, and of course you need to measure that, but at the end, these quotes were not very popular in the population, and in a way, it means that maybe language is not the good. Is not an incitative thing for the people. It will be very interesting to know if the people who live in a village would choose the nearest court, even if it's not in their language. Because of course, after you have maybe the interpreters, and you have the possibility anyway to defend your claims in front of any court. And the other thing, of course, is the popularity of the traditional customary courts, because in the 20s you have still a kind of legal pluralism in a lot of places. So, this failure you show in your papers, in a way it can ask us if the language is a good way finally the Soviet did not succeed with the language, even if they use a very important and sophisticated way to put it at the forefront. And I have another question for Viktoria. Of course, this Abraham Kirschnitz is really an interesting man, and maybe between Bundism and Zionism, maybe, but I was wondering, because he was very active in the Far East Republic, so he was very, he must meet a lot of intellectuals who were Siberian autonomists at the time. And so the idea can be to settle a kind of multi-ethnic free land in Siberia. You mentioned Koreans, Chinese, Mongolian, and all these minorities. So did he have, I mean, connection, interaction with other minority leaders, in order to settle this idea of kind of land which can become a colonization land, but for all minorities? Thank you.
Thank you so very much for a lovely panel. One brief comment and two quick questions. The comment is that if the Zionists say that the Bundists are not popular and vice versa, and the Volkists say that nobody is popular, they're probably all right. Other than that, we heard about the Bund in Viktoria's paper, and I was really thinking about the Bund when Olena presented, because it looked like, to me, it looked like a Buddhist program. Now, the Bund was dissolved in 1921 in the Soviet Union. Still, it feels like there is something Bundist in there, either in the program or in the vision, or as a way of taking ex-Bundists and making them serve the Soviet something. So I would like to hear more about that. And to Viktoria, I was thinking, of course, from the start about the autonomous area in the Far East. And you got to that, that's great. But the question for me was not his own transformation or going east or whatever it was, but was there any continuity, was there any circulation on the part of the authorities from previous experiences and dealings with the nationalities questions to the 1931 project, or whenever that was?
I also have a very short question, sorry. I might have misunderstood, but Olena, when you were talking about the motives, you said, sort of en passant, that the language minorities, such as Ukrainian, and I was wondering if Ukrainian was considered a minority language. It seems sort of contradictory to make it the only sort of official language. So was there a change? Did more people adapt Ukrainian so it wasn't the minority language anymore? Or, I don't know, were there other reasonings behind it? So maybe you could just very quickly, also in combination with Sabine's comment, just very shortly answer this one as well. Thank you.
I think we have space for one more question, but then...
Anybody else?
Oh, Jeremy. A brief question, and then you have the floor again.
Yeah, I think my question can be pretty brief. I don't really see non-territorial autonomy. I see some non-territoriality, but I do not see autonomy. Or autonomy is not a very accurate word. You could say more self-governance. Self-government. I don't see much of it, and I'm just wondering about that. And if somebody could enlighten me, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, then I pass the microphone in this direction. For a brief comment on Jeremy, this is about non-territorial arrangements and less about self-government, as you correctly remarked.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, because I already thought how to comment on Barry's comment. So here is some autonomy. So the parishes were somehow, or in most regions, more autonomously are organized before 1918 as they are today. So the priests lived on, so there were rich parishes and poor ones, because most of the parishes and the priest center who became the parish priest, they lived on so-called Pfründe, so they had estates or some mills or whatsoever. So they were somehow like an independent company as soon as there was the priest in the parish. So, and this is also what I ask myself is then, how long can the priest, for example, deny to use one language or another before the bishop can intervene? And if the bishop intervenes, is he allowed to? And this is also one of the reasons why I will go to the Vatican archives soon, because it's really astonishing how many people made direct complaints to the Pope, and it's all there in the archives. And it's not only politicians or cardinals complaining, but it's simple parishioners saying, we have a priest there who is openly Slovene or German nationalist, etc. So seemingly the bishop, as soon as there is the priest, didn't have so much power in his hands to change that immediately. I don't really know. So what is really interesting in that case, I was really surprised that there is almost no work on the language use on the Roman Catholic Church so far. So I'm just guessing. But I think it's something how there was the bishop, there was the diocese, but lots of parishes were run like an independent country somehow, to say it bluntly. What I also left out totally is all these parishes run by monasteries because they are totally separately organized. What is just two brief comments, because we are already running out of time for my next coffee, is what is really important, and this is also totally different as we know the Roman Catholic Church today. It was totally usual that priests and even bishops were parliamentarians, was it in Vienna in the parliament or in one of the provincial diets. So this was usual, and so they brought this internal discussion to the public or vice versa. Pragmatism, of course, what comes in, and this is something I still have to study more, is that they always argued with this, well, we have to save their soul, so there is this canon law of why to take care that all the languages are used, because confession has to be done and everybody has to understand one another when there is confession or when someone's dying. So there is a different layer of argument why to take care that all the languages are covered. But anyway, it's a pragmatism too, and they should have somehow overcome nationalism, as you said, but they did not. So it's very often it's the same debate like in all the other spheres of the Habsburg monarchy. Jurisdiction, well, territorial, yes, these Anteile I showed you seemingly are territorially organized somehow, but somehow not. There is then always some parishes who do not really go that way, so this is still something I have to research. Unfortunately, there is no real academic literature on that available. I was really surprised. Don't understand why. And thanks for Mattia Maya, already Googled him. Could become really useful. I have a question to Olena. I take it now that I'm here. So Habsburg times, army, usually when someone spoke Yiddish, they noted as his first language German. So I was really surprised that they made up two groups, and I'm wondering why. So my first guess was if you don't have, you weaken both of them, because if you have one group, they are all German speakers, then you have more German speakers. If you separate Yiddish from German, you weaken them both because they are less in number than. So I'm just guessing why, or was there a debate? And who is a Yiddish speaker? So only Jews, or could Jews also be counted as German speakers? So what as he said, like with the census and the dioceses, who collected this, and what were people asked for their native language, for the language of daily use, or what? Thank you.
So I have quite a few questions, but I will be very, very brief. So first, Boris, you asked me what those party officials criticized. They criticized the practices, because there were practices of having national desks, for instance, when you can come and take whatever paper in your national language, and they said this is wrong. So what we need to do is to ensure that there is a person, say, of the German speaker in the committee, rather than have a committee of one language and the table at this national desk. But there were also like cases of city elections among sort of separate minorities. So there were practices that they were criticizing, not hypothetically, but actual practices. And the popularity and the alternatives and the language, that the question is actually, everything is connected, because indeed there were alternatives, right? So there were no alternatives if, for instance, you lived within a territorial unit where there was only one court, which is say in Polish. But then if you don't speak Polish, you then can get an interpreter, or the court should have been set up in a way that there would be Ukrainian and a Polish in parallel. But actually the language is a very important question here, because my previous paper, and this is the one I discussed with the team last year, was about the Polish minority. Well, it was very hard to define who was Polish actually, and the problem is that in some localities when they were doing the census, there would be 60% Roman Catholics, but only 5% of them would speak Polish, right? So they all were regarded or kind of recorded as Poles, but not necessarily because they spoke the language. And this is, for me, actually, when I was working on this paper, for me was, would a so-called recorded Pole who doesn't speak Polish get an interpreter to work in the Polish court? Or would it be just because he's in the passport Polish, would he be kind of assumed to be able to address the court in Polish? So this for me was a complication here. And indeed, I think the Soviet authorities really put the language as number one criterion, right? But the people on the ground, and especially when we think 1924, 1926, is just what? Not even 10 years since the fall of the Romanov Empire, which was an assimilatory empire where Russian was the main language, where there were no schools, like official schools for Polish or whatever other minority. So we actually speak about largely assimilated Russian-speaking community rather than even Ukrainian speaker, and this relates to your question. I didn't speak about it, but actually one of the motivations to set up those national courts was to oppose further Russification of the republic, because, for instance, Jewish minority would prefer to address the court in Russian because they just simply didn't speak Ukrainian, and if you don't have a Jewish court, they would go to a Russian court, thus sort of kind of empowering the Russian language rather than the Ukrainian language. So this was also a way to promote Ukrainian, kind of weakening the Russian part. And just quickly about the Bundist is actually an interesting question. I tried to discuss it a little bit in the paper, but actually the idea of those courts, or courts in Yiddish, was first promoted by Jewish activists before it became the policy of the Soviet authorities. So the Jews proposed it, and then the Soviets implemented it as a general policy. But I need to see who those Jewish activists were. It might as well be the link to Bundists. Yes, I think if there are any more questions, I can then.
Well, I got so many comments and questions, and I'm very happy. Thank you so much, everyone. I will be as short as possible. and maybe I will go in more details during coffee break. So the first question will, the first answer will be about the terms. It was quite interesting how the audience, which is not very much into Siberian issues, can perceive the idea, the geographical terms. So I use the term Siberia, and I know that it's complicated. Everything is complicated, and I use it as an imaginary geographical term, which was actually used by Jews from Chelyabinsk to Harbin, and they referred to Siberia when they talk about the Urals, actually Siberia and the Far East. And the notion Far East is also quite complicated because it's a quite late notion, and for Jews it was not very important because they saw the territory from Chelyabinsk to Harbin as a whole. And just a quick example, for instance, after the revolution in Harbin, there was a journal which was called Sibir Palestina, which was connected to the issues in Japan, in China, and Manchuria, and in Russia as well. So they wrote about Tomsk, Chita, Irkutsk, and so on. That was okay for them because for them it was all Siberia. That's why I use this term. The question about the measurable tools, how we understand the unpopularity or popularity of different political groups, my answer will be very short. Well, we can look at the results of the elections to Jewish community boards, to Jewish community councils. I think it will be much more representative than to look, for instance, at the elections to City Duma, because we have more actors at the elections. But as for community boards, we see that Bundis never got more than 20% at best. So that's why we can understand that Bundis were not very popular. Un-Bundist nature of Abram Kirznets during his stay in Siberia, it's a very good question. And I would add another question to this one. How Siberian reality influenced the personal position of Kirznets. I think that his un-Bundist idea about immigration to Siberia actually was influenced by the reality he saw. He saw the problem of refugees, the prisoners of war, and so on. He also knew a lot about the discussion about the new Pale, when a lot of Jews, thousands of Jews, had to migrate deeper to the east, and he saw actually the potential of Siberia. And here I can switch the question to the question from the audience. Yes, about the continuity of the idea to resettlement to the Far East. That's quite interesting, and I started thinking about it previously. I didn't mention here, but Boris knows about the project which was proposed actually by Abram Kirznets, the project which he proposed to the Joint, it's an American distribution committee, in 1919. He proposed to make Siberia a center of Jewish immigration, actually, and he proposed a plan what should be done to make it work. And then it's also quite interesting because we know that the Birobidzhan project was created in other circumstances. It was because the Soviets, as Olena showed us at the beginning of her presentation, they didn't recognize the idea of non-territorial autonomy. So it was well, natural to think that the Birobidzhan idea was totally Soviet idea, but now we see the connections between Kirznets project and the Yevsekция, which were Jewish activists of Bolshevik party, and actually they were interested in Kirznets project in the early 20s already. So they wanted to reconsider Kirznets project, to think about the resettlement even then, not later. And later, this project became true, actually. So we have a continuity here. We see it, actually. What else? The question about... yes. I suppose I don't have a quick answer for this question, and maybe we should talk to Irina and discuss it together, because she's much better specialist in the field of Vlasnichestvo and the situation in the Far East Republic. So let's do it on the coffee break. And join us if you want to hear the discussion. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, the three of you. We are running late, which is of course my fault, because I talked too long. And we had 3 papers. Yeah, we had slightly had more time. But now we go to coffee break. And as there is a very classical Austrian or Germanophone thing, we start the next presentation cum tempore, CT, which means 15 minutes later. So I hope, David, you will be passionate to have 15 more minutes to start. Okay, thank you. Enjoy your coffee break. Thank you for the panelists.